Look around you. Everywhere you see people suffering from the same fundamental vulnerability. Not physical weakness, not intellectual limitation, but psychological fragility. They're triggered by criticism. They collapse under pressure. They're manipulated through their insecurities. They're controlled by their fears and unacknowledged desires. Despite all our technological and material progress, most humans remain remarkably easy to destabilize psychologically. But occasionally, you encounter someone different, someone who seems mysteriously immune to the psychological weapons that work so reliably on others. Criticism slides off them. Manipulation attempts fail. Social pressure doesn't sway them. They maintain equilibrium where others lose balance. They possess a form of psychological invulnerability that appears almost superhuman. What's their secret? Are they simply born with thicker emotional armor? Do they lack normal human sensitivities? Or have they discovered something about the structure of the human psyche that most people never grasp? Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, identified a pathway to this psychological invulnerability, a method so powerful yet so counterintuitive that most people never discover it. He called it shadow integration, and it represents the most direct route to becoming what we might call mentally untouchable. Jung's map of the hidden self. To understand how Jung's approach creates psychological invulnerability, we first need to comprehend what he meant by the shadow, a concept that goes far deeper than the popular understanding suggests. Jung defined the shadow as the part of the unconscious mind consisting of repressed weaknesses, shortcomings, and instincts. But this clinical description doesn't capture the shadow's true nature or power. The shadow isn't simply negative qualities you prefer not to see. It's the complete counter-identity to your conscious self-concept, containing everything you've rejected from your conscious identity. Everyone carries a shadow, Jung wrote, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. This observation reveals something crucial. The shadow isn't static. It grows in proportion to how strongly you identify with its opposite. The more you insist, I am X, the more powerful not X becomes in your shadow. This explains why the most self-righteous people often have the darkest shadow expressions. The person who consciously identifies as perpetually kind harbors extraordinary cruelty in their shadow. The individual who sees themselves as perfectly rational contains wild irrationality in their unconscious. The moral crusader carries unacknowledged depravity. The shadow forms through a process Jung called dissociation, the psyche's method of protecting itself from qualities it finds threatening. As children, we quickly learn which aspects of ourselves draw approval and which provoke rejection. We identify with the former and reject the latter, pushing unacceptable qualities out of consciousness and into the shadow. This process isn't optional or pathological. It's how human consciousness develops. The problem isn't having a shadow, but remaining unconscious of it. As Jung observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This unconsciousness creates the fundamental vulnerability that makes most people psychologically manipulable. When you remain unaware of shadow contents, those contents control you from below consciousness. They erupt as inexplicable emotional reactions, self-sabotaging behaviors, and moral blind spots. Worse, they create buttons that others can push to predictably destabilize you. Think about how easily people are triggered by accusations that touch their shadow material. Call a secretly insecure person weak, and watch their disproportionate reaction. Suggest a privately doubtful believer might be wrong, and observe their dogmatic defense. Hint that a publicly virtuous person has selfish motives, and note their moral outrage. These reactions aren't random, they're shadow material being activated. Those who can identify your shadow contents gain tremendous psychological leverage over you. They can provoke reactions, derail your reasoning, and manipulate your behavior with remarkable precision. This vulnerability persists as long as you remain unconscious of your shadow, regardless of your intelligence, education, or conscious intentions. How your shadow controls you. Jung identified projection as the primary mechanism through which the unconscious shadow controls your perceptions and behaviors. Projection, he wrote, is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. Everything that is unconscious in ourselves we discover in our neighbor, and we treat him accordingly. This projection mechanism operates continuously, coloring your perception without your awareness. The aggression you've disowned in yourself becomes the aggression you're hypersensitive to in others. The selfishness you've rejected from your identity becomes the selfishness you're quick to condemn around you. The weakness you refuse to acknowledge becomes the weakness you unconsciously seek and attack in others. Projection doesn't simply distort perception. It creates psychological hooks that others can use to manipulate you. When someone activates your projection, you no longer respond to them, but to your own disowned material. You fight shadows while believing you're addressing external reality. Consider how this operates in everyday scenarios. In arguments, you respond not to what the other person actually said, but to what you projected onto their words. In relationships, you react not to your partner's actual qualities, but to the disowned aspects of yourself you've projected onto them. In political discourse, you attack not the actual positions of opponents, but the shadow elements you've projected onto their views. This projection mechanism explains why people with unintegrated shadows are so easily manipulated through emotional triggers. Activate their projection, and their rational faculties shut down. Their emotions hijack their thinking. They respond to internally generated content while believing they're addressing external reality. Want to understand more about psychological invulnerability? Hit subscribe now. The person with an integrated shadow, by contrast, recognizes projection as it occurs. They distinguish between genuine external threats and internally generated projections. They maintain psychological equilibrium because they aren't fighting shadows. They're addressing reality as it actually exists, rather than as filtered through unconscious material. This distinction creates the first layer of psychological invulnerability: freedom from manipulation through projection triggers. When you've integrated shadow elements, attacks that would provoke emotional reactivity in others simply provide information to you. You respond strategically rather than reactively because you're not defending against recognition of disowned parts of yourself. The paradox of vulnerability: strength through acknowledgement. Jung's approach to psychological strength contains a paradox that many find difficult to accept. True invulnerability comes not from denying weakness, but from fully acknowledging it. The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem and the epitome of a whole outlook on life, he wrote. This represents a radical departure from conventional approaches to psychological strength, which typically emphasize positive thinking, affirmation of strengths, and avoidance of negative self-concepts. Jung recognized that these approaches often strengthen the ego while leaving the shadow intact, creating the illusion of strength while preserving fundamental vulnerability. True psychological invulnerability requires what Jung called the way of what might seem like self-degradation. Acknowledging your capacity for behaviors and qualities you've previously rejected from your identity. The person who has fully confronted their potential for cowardice cannot be manipulated through fear of appearing weak. The individual who has acknowledged their capacity for cruelty cannot be controlled through their need to maintain a purely virtuous self-image. This explains why some of the most psychologically formidable individuals often speak openly about their flaws, weaknesses, and darker capacities. This isn't self-deprecation, but shadow integration. The recognition that acknowledging these qualities removes their power to control you from the unconscious. Consider how this operates in practical scenarios. When someone attempts to shame you for a quality you've already acknowledged in yourself, their attack finds no target. When they try to trigger insecurity you've already confronted, no reaction occurs. When they attempt to manipulate you through fear of a self-image loss you've already accepted, their leverage disappears. Jung described this paradoxical strength. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner contradictions, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposite halves. This insight reveals why shadow integration creates seemingly miraculous psychological resilience. The person who has made their inner contradictions conscious no longer projects them outward or has them triggered from outside. They've removed the primary mechanism through which external forces can destabilize them psychologically. The integration process, becoming mentally untouchable. Jung didn't just identify the shadow, he developed specific approaches to integrating it and achieving psychological invulnerability. These methods form what we might call Jung's shadow code, the practical pathway to becoming mentally untouchable. The first step is shadow recognition. Developing awareness of the specific contents of your shadow, Jung suggested several methods for this discovery process, including dream analysis, active imagination, and triggered reaction examination. The common principle is attention to what provokes disproportionate emotional responses. Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, Jung observed. This provides a practical starting point. Identify what triggers strong negative reactions in you. The qualities that most disturb you in others almost certainly exist in your shadow. The political positions that provoke your strongest outrage likely connect to disowned aspects of your psyche. The behaviors in others that seem inexcusable to you often reflect qualities you've rejected in yourself. This recognition process isn't about accepting harmful behaviors, but about acknowledging your capacity for what you judge most harshly in others. It's the difference between saying, "That person is evil and I am good," and recognizing, "That person has acted on capacities that exist within me as well." The first statement strengthens the shadow. The second integrates it. The second step is shadow acceptance, acknowledging the shadow qualities as legitimate parts of your complete psyche rather than aberrations to be eliminated. There is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection, Jung wrote. This acceptance doesn't mean acting on destructive impulses, but recognizing them as aspects of your complete humanity rather than alien intrusions. This acceptance process involves what Jung called withdrawing projections, recognizing when you're perceiving your own shadow contents in external situations. Instead of fighting these qualities in others, you acknowledge them in yourself. Instead of being triggered by accusations that touch shadow material, you recognize the partial truth they contain while maintaining perspective on your complete identity. The third step is shadow integration, incorporating shadow qualities into conscious identity in constructive forms. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, Jung noted. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This integration doesn't mean surrendering to destructive impulses, but channeling their energy constructively. The aggression you've disowned can become healthy assertiveness when integrated. The selfishness you've rejected can transform into appropriate self-care. The irrational elements you've suppressed can emerge as creative insight. Integration doesn't eliminate these qualities, but transforms them from unconscious disruptors to conscious resources. This integration process creates psychological wholeness that makes manipulation through shadow triggering impossible. When someone attempts to activate shadow material you've already integrated, they simply highlight aspects of yourself you've already acknowledged. Their psychological weapons find no vulnerable target because you've removed the unconscious hooks they would typically exploit. The untouchable mind, practical applications. Jung's shadow integration approach creates psychological invulnerability that manifests in practical ways across various domains of life. Understanding these applications reveals why shadow work represents such a powerful path to mental untouchability. In personal relationships, shadow integration prevents the unconscious projections that typically create recurring conflicts. Rather than seeing partners through the distorting lens of your shadow, you perceive them more accurately. Criticism that would trigger defensive reactions in others becomes information for self-reflection. Attempts at emotional manipulation fail because the buttons others would push have been consciously examined and diffused. In professional environments, shadow integration creates remarkable immunity to office politics and power games. The colleague who attempts to trigger your insecurity finds no reaction. The subtle undermining that would provoke others into career-damaging responses slides off you. The social pressure that would typically force compliance with group thinking loses its power when you've integrated the fear of rejection driving that compliance. In public discourse, shadow integration enables maintaining clear thinking amidst emotional triggering that derails others. Political rhetoric designed to activate unconscious biases loses effectiveness. Moral outrage that would cloud others' judgment becomes an opportunity for deeper understanding. Arguments that would provoke defensive reaction in most become opportunities for genuine consideration when shadow material doesn't automatically activate. This mental untouchability doesn't mean becoming emotionless or developing thick skin in the conventional sense. It means achieving a fundamentally different relationship with your complete psyche. One where triggers don't work, because you've already consciously acknowledged what those triggers target. The results often appear almost supernatural to those who haven't undergone the process. The integrated individual maintains composure in situations where others become emotionally hijacked. They speak truth, others are afraid to acknowledge. They remain centered when everyone around them loses balance. They see clearly when others are blinded by projection. This isn't because they lack normal human sensitivity, but because they've achieved what Jung called individuation, psychological wholeness that transcends the fragmentation, keeping most people vulnerable to manipulation. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, Jung wrote, but by integration of the contraries. The invulnerable psyche. Jung's shadow code reveals a counterintuitive truth. Psychological invulnerability doesn't come from building stronger defenses, but from eliminating the need for defenses altogether. When you've integrated your shadow, attacks that would devastate others simply provide information. Triggers that would hijack normal functioning slide off without effect. Manipulation techniques that reliably control most people fail entirely. This isn't theoretical, but practical. Those who undergo thorough shadow integration develop a form of psychological immunity that appears almost superhuman to those still operating from fragmented consciousness. They aren't triggerable. They aren't manipulable through shame, fear, or insecurity. They maintain clarity where others become emotionally reactive. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, Jung wrote, but by making the darkness conscious. This insight captures the essence of his approach to psychological strength. True mental untouchability comes not from denying darkness, but from bringing it into the light of consciousness, where it transforms from vulnerability to power. The ultimate paradox of Jung's shadow code is that complete acknowledgement of weakness creates unprecedented strength. By confronting and integrating all you've disowned, you achieve psychological wholeness that makes external manipulation virtually impossible. You become mentally untouchable not because you're invulnerable to harm, but because you've already confronted the internal harm most people spend their lives avoiding. This path isn't easy. It requires courage to face what you've spent a lifetime denying. It demands honesty few are willing to practice with themselves. It necessitates abandoning comforting but false self-conceptions. Yet the reward, psychological freedom that few humans ever experience, makes the journey worthwhile. In a world where most remain unconsciously controlled by their shadows, those who integrate this disowned material achieve a form of liberation that manifests as seemingly miraculous psychological resilience. They aren't special or superhuman. They've simply had the courage to complete the psychological work most never begin, transforming their greatest vulnerability into unassailable strength.